personnel has been relatively cautious and proportional, but it's come alongside quite a lot of brutal mockery of Britain from official Kremlin outlets. Senior Russian spokesmen have by and large kept off the airways, but I was able to catch up with Mr. Putin's ambassador to the European Union, Vladimir Chichkov, in Brussels this week. Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, and other NATO allies have all said that Russia was responsible for the nerve attack in Salisbury. Were you?
Highly likely, they said. Russia, and I can assure you, without using the phraseology like highly likely,
14 hours.
which has become very popular these days, Russia had nothing to do with it.
Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, has gone even further, and he said that it is very, very likely that Vladimir Putin himself ordered this attack.
Well, that rests with the responsibility of Boris Johnson, who I believe is acting in an inappropriate manner, which doesn't give him credit.
This was an attack on a man widely regarded in Russia as a traitor, using a chemical agent regarded as being made in Russia. And that is why many people in Britain say it is overwhelmingly likely the Russians must have been responsible. And if not the Russians, who?
Well, this whole case is based on assumptions, based on suspicions fueled by emotions. You're rightly referred to Mr. Skripal as a traitor, as a defector, but, you know, I can assure you that he is almost forgotten in Russia. He has been living in Britain for 8 years now. Before that, I think I should stress the point, he was officially pardoned by a presidential decree, which means that whatever one can think of him in the moral sense, but from the legal point of view, the Russian state had nothing against him. And also, I should add, his daughter, Yulia, is a Russian citizen. That's why among the many violations by the British authorities in this case, I will cite that it is a blatant violation of the bilateral consular convention by not allowing Russian diplomats and consular officials access to a Russian citizen currently in hospital.
And the Russian state has now announced criminal investigations into the attempted murder of Yulia Skripal and indeed Mr. Glushkov as well. Can I ask, as part of that investigation, whether Russian authorities will be seeking access to the nerve agent and to the police who are involved in the case?
Certainly, the Russian investigative committee will request cooperation from the British authorities according to international law and existing bilateral agreements. Actually, the Russian side, through the embassy in London, requested access to evidence, if any, if there is any, to the nerve agent from the very beginning, from the first day, but was flatly refused. In spite of that being Britain's obligation on the basis of the International Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
This is a very obscure nerve agent, not much understood around the world. Has Russia ever produced this agent, Novichok?
No.
Never?
No. Actually, Russia has stopped production of any chemical agents back in 1992. So you cannot even talk about any chemical agents produced by Russia. All that had been produced previously was produced by the Soviet Union. In 1992, the then President Boris Yeltsin signed a decree stopping all production, and according to the International Convention on Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, last year in 2017, Russia destroyed all its stockpiles. There is only one country today which hasn't done so, which is still retaining its chemical stockpiles, and that is the United States of America.
Can I be absolutely clear then, Russia has no stockpiles of any nerve agents whatever?
Indeed, no stockpiles whatsoever.
So then there is the question, how did this agent come to be used in Salisbury? It has been suggested, for instance, that during the dissolution of the Soviet Union, some of this agent may have been stolen or sold and ended up in the hands of either criminal gangs or other state parties. What's your view?
Well, why don't you ask yourself the question, how come the British authorities so quickly managed to designate the nerve agent used as something called Novichok? It can only mean that they had some standard...
It has a signature, I think. It has a chemical signature that they were able to...
But when you have a nerve agent or whatever, you check it against certain samples that you retain in your laboratories. And Porton Down, as we now all know, is the largest military facility in the United Kingdom that has been dealing with chemical weapons research. And it's actually only 8 miles from Salisbury.
You're not suggesting that Porton Down is responsible for this nerve agent?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't have any evidence of anything having been used. And of course, I should add perhaps that I exclude the possibility of any stockpiles of any chemical weapons fleeing Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
You don't think
there were certain specialists, including scientists who today claim to have been responsible for creating some nerve agent that have been whisked out of Russia and are currently residing in the United Kingdom.
So they defected. They said it was made, and that it was tested in Uzbekistan, for instance, and that therefore it was around and could have been stolen, could have been sold on.
I will not comment on their words, but they were involved in certain research of various chemical weapons, yes,
okay.
In the Soviet years.
In her response, first response, Theresa May has expelled 23 Russian citizens. Were they spies?
Of course not. They were diplomats.
Are there any Russian spies in Britain?
Come on. You're not asking the right person, perhaps. Are there any British spies in Russia?
One of the other possibilities that Britain has talked about is the use of the so-called Magnitsky Act to freeze the assets of various people who've been using London to wash money through London, individuals. In some respects, I would imagine you would welcome that.
Well, I wouldn't care about the fate of money being laundered in London, be it Russian or of any other origin.
And what about the suggestion that members of the royal family and politicians and so forth won't come to Russia for the World Cup? The World Cup was going to be a very, very big moment for modern Russia. Is this a blow to Russia?
Well, I'm sure that those members of the royal family who had been planning to come will be sorry hearing that from their own government.
It's been a very difficult time in relations between Russia and Britain. There's been a whole series of issues, alleged Russian involvement in elections in Europe and America and Britain as well, lots of tensions over the Baltic states and Ukraine and so forth. Looking ahead, what do you see for Britain's relations with Russia after we've left the EU?
Well, you know, at one point I said to a British colleague of mine that I was actually looking into a bright future of Russian-British relations after Brexit, because Britain was no longer be confined by EU sanctions or anything like that. Somehow he didn't support that view.
I mean, at this period, there is almost universal anger about British-Russian relationships in Britain at the moment. Gavin Williamson...
And in Russia too.
And in Russia too. Gavin Williamson, our new defence secretary, said recently that Russia is going to be thinking, how can we cause so much pain in Britain, damage its economy, rip its infrastructure apart, cause thousands and thousands of deaths, and create total chaos within the UK? That is the perspective of a senior British minister about your country now.
Well, he also said, if I remember correctly, the wording that Russia should shut up and go away. Let me assure that Russia is not going to shut up and will certainly not go away.
There has been a sort of sense in Britain that Russia was almost mocking us about this terrible attack, Some of your presenters have talked about the British climate being very unhealthy for Russian defectors and people falling out of buildings, and even your president has talked about traitors eating poison and so forth, almost as if people in Moscow regard this as a funny matter.
It certainly is not a funny matter, and actually the latest news that I heard from Moscow referred to the launch of 2 criminal investigations by the Russian Investigative Committee on damage to the health of a Russian citizen, Ms. Yulia Skripal, and the unexplained mysterious death of Mr. Nikolai Glushkov.
And to be absolutely clear, Russian investigators will come to British police shortly and say, we want access to this investigation, we want to work alongside you when it comes to what happened in Salisbury, and we would like to see the nerve agent used, and we would like proper access.
Of course they will, first through correspondence, then perhaps should a personal visit be required, then they will come. And actually Russia has offered to cooperate on the Salisbury incident from the very outset, but we didn't get any answer whatsoever from the Foreign Office or any other government agency.
Well, listening to that is the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson. Welcome, Mr. Johnson. We have to be very clear and very careful, of course, about this, the evidence in this very serious matter. So you have said it's overwhelmingly likely that Vladimir Putin was responsible. You saw the ambassador brush that aside. Why do you say that?
Well, we gave the Russians a very clear choice, and the Prime Minister said on Monday, as I said to the Russian ambassador to the UK, either help us to understand how the stockpiles of Novichok have gone missing and how some of it could have turned up on the streets of Wiltshire in this way, or else I'm afraid we will be forced, as the Prime Minister said in the House of Commons, to draw the conclusion, as we did in the case of Alexander Litvinenko, that the trail of culpability leads inexorably to the Kremlin. And I think listening to the Russian response, listening again to the response of the Russian ambassador to the EU with his satirical suggestion that this was done by UK agents from Porton Down, this is not the response of a country that really believes itself to be innocent. This is not the response of a country that really wants to engage in getting to the bottom of the matter.
The Prime Minister told the House of Commons there were 2 possible explanations of this. Either this was a deliberate attack by the Russian state, or else the Novichok had come out and become and got into the hands of criminal gangs. You seem to be excluding the latter possibility now.
We gave the Russians every opportunity to come up with an alternative hypothesis such as the one that you have just described, and they haven't. And their response has been a sort of mixture of smug sarcasm and denial, obfuscation and delay. So what we are doing on the Novichok and on the nerve agent, what we will do is tomorrow, technical experts from the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons will come from The Hague to the UK. We will share the samples with them. They will then be tested by the most reputable possible international laboratories. And I might just say, in response to Mr. Chizov's point about Russian stockpiles of chemical weapons, we actually have evidence within the last 10 years that Russia has not only been investigating the delivery of nerve agents for the purposes of assassination, but has also been creating and stockpiling Novichok.
So that was a direct lie that I was being given there.
But you will get that, and that is exactly the tactics that we've come to expect from Russia over the last few years. And one of the things that has really struck me in the course of the last few days, as we've been talking to friends and colleagues around the world, is the difference between their reaction this time and their reaction to the death of Alexander Litvinenko. And then back in 2006, there was a much more hesitation, much more people saying, well, perhaps it could be rogue elements of the Russian state and so on and so forth. Now you have people such as Nikki Haley, the US ambassador to the UN, with her very, very powerful denunciation of Russia, and my colleague Jacek Kapuczynski on Friday in London, pointing the finger squarely at Russia. And I think what that indicates is the change in people's attitudes towards Russia because of the experience of the last 10 years.
Is it change in attitudes, their attitude to us? They don't really